Well, good morning, everybody. It does feel like we are getting closer to our normal routine today. That makes me feel quite joyful. And of course, today is a significant day for another reason. In case you hadn't noticed from the fireworks that were going off late into the night last night, today is the 4th of July, what is celebrated in our nation as Independence Day. And I will say that this is probably the day out of the entire year when our church, when we as an Anabaptist congregation, look the most different from other churches around the country. Because most Sundays, I would say that our similarities by far overwhelm our differences. You walk into a church on Sunday morning, whether it's Baptist or Presbyterian or Methodist or Mennonite, and we all read the same Bible, we pray to the same God, we all sing similar songs, we all have to deal with long-winded preachers. Like it's a universal experience that you have, regardless of what tradition you're in. But on July 4th, if you walk into many, if not most, of the congregations here in the United States, you will see it decked out in red, white, and blue, and you'll probably hear the Battle Hymn to the Republic or God Bless America sung on the morning. You might even have a moment in the service when people say the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag. And you may have noticed that we haven't done any of those things here this morning. Well, it's not because we forgot about what was going on this weekend, but it's because the Anabaptist tradition has, for many hundreds of years now, challenged the idea that God's interests and the interests of a country or a state, to use more official language, are one and the same, that they always overlap. Oftentimes they can diverge. And so, just to give one example of this, of course, one of the principles in Scripture, which is expressed quite clearly in Acts, is that God shows no partiality, no favoritism, that is, to any different person. But in every nation, anyone who fears God and does what is right is acceptable to God. God doesn't treat people better or worse based on their national identity. But countries, states, do. It's the nature of states. They work for the benefit of their own people and the interests of their own people first before those of anybody else, even when it might not necessarily be just or fair or right. And so that makes us question whether it's wise for us as followers of Christ to pledge allegiance to any institution that may not have God's interests perfectly in mind. And so we have for a long time questioned whether it's appropriate to praise the violence, the national celebration, the highlighting of our achievements as a part of our worship. Now, I've found in discussing this with most Christians outside of the Mennonite world that most people honestly haven't put much thought into this. They just tend to assume that God and country go hand in hand, right? And so these things are novel ideas that there might be conflict between them. But there are some Christians, including, to be honest, some Mennonites and Mennonite church leaders, who have thought through these issues about how the church should relate to the government and who have come to a different set of conclusions than we have, who have come to believe that it is, in fact, appropriate for us to be celebrating our nation or giving praise and thanks to our nation's leaders as a part of our worship experience. And I think that it's important for us to be listening to these voices, to be taking them seriously, even though it's a perspective that we as a church don't share. It's one that we can learn from. There might be things to teach us, and if nothing else, at least it's valuable for us to kind of clarify our own position and why we do the things we do more intentionally. So I want to note. Well, let's call this patriotism. That perhaps might be a somewhat neutral way of talking about it. Christian patriotism, right? And I was spending some time trying to engage different voices in favor of Christian patriotism this week, and from my way of interpreting it, I saw basically three sets of arguments, three basic kinds of rationales that people offer for why we should perhaps celebrate our nation here on a Sunday morning, in contrast to what we do here at Shalom. And perhaps the most basic of those is gratitude. Many people point out that we are fortunate to live in a nation that offers the freedom of religion, that we are protected by that nation. And as Mennonites in particular, we even get special protections that exempt us from things like going to war or having to swear oaths. And this is extraordinarily unusual in the history of the world. And so it's appropriate for us to express gratitude for these things on a day like the 4th of July. Others would take it further still and would say that it's not just a matter of gratitude, but a matter of duty. That as people, God has placed each of us within the boundaries of a certain nation or kingdom, and that, as Romans 13 makes abundantly clear, we all should submit to and participate in this order. It's interesting that Romans 13 not only says that we ought to pay taxes, but even if honor is due, that we should pay honor to the nations or the governing authorities over us. And so people interpret this as, yes, it is not only out of appreciation, but as duty of citizens that we should be acknowledging, supporting, celebrating the country that we find ourselves in. And then further still, perhaps the most extreme version would be what we sometimes call American exceptionalism. And these are people who say, well, yes, we ought to be doing these things, of course, because the United States of America has a special role to play in God's story of salvation. According to this way of viewing things, God has always called upon a nation to lead the charge in bringing God's will on earth. First, it was the nation of Israel, but after many hundred years, Israel fell from that position, and then maybe it was the Roman Empire, and then, I don't know, maybe some of the different kingdoms that were in Europe. But however it went today, that responsibility falls to the United States of America. We have God's calling upon us, and therefore our story and the Bible story are almost completely intertwined. This is very closely related to the notion of manifest destiny that you may have heard us discussing here in recent weeks, which justified for many early colonists taking over land that had belonged previously to native peoples, and claiming that this is God's will for the world. Now, these are three very different kinds of arguments, and so I want to kind of address them in reverse order, because the further down we go, the harder it is to find something that we might agree with. But I think as we move our way upwards, we might be able to find some nuanced appreciation, conversation. for why for what we should be doing on a day like the 4th of July. I want to start with this kind of, it says Christian patriotism here, but really what I want to start with is addressing this American exceptionalism notion. The main critique that I think we ought to have of this idea that America is the nation that God is choosing to save the world is that that is a misreading of the biblical story. This is one of the main reasons why we spent a year plus going through the biblical story this past year, right? So that we could be properly and healthily grounded in it. I think that the main problem with this perspective is that people make some very bad assumptions about what God is up to in that story. One of them that I'd point out is that we believe that it is the community, the people of God as a community, not the state, not the fact that it was a monarchy of Israel, that is the center of God's saving activity on earth, right? And we would point out that this is actually expressed in the Old Testament story itself. That at the moment when the community of God decided that they wanted to become more than just a community, but they wanted to become a government, a state. And it says, then the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations. God's response to this was, the Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. God interpreted this turning to earthly powers and earthly institutions as a rejection. God let them do it. But this was not seen as a good thing or a practice that we ought to be trying to continue in new countries and in new ways today. I think the second way that we critique the reading of this story is that we believe that the community of Israel was expanded, not rejected in the story of the Bible. I think it's important to remember passages like this that we have from Isaiah, where God says, can a woman forget her nursing child or show no compassion for the child of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. Here, God, in referring to herself as a mother, as a perfect mother, calls upon the bond that we see in many healthy households of mothers who love their children, who are deeply attached to their children, and says, if these mothers who are human and imperfect are that committed to their own children, do you think that we are going to be any less, that I, as God, am going to be any less committed to the people of Israel? No way. So, no, it wouldn't make sense that God would reject the people of Israel. We see that they are redeemed and restored and that they matter all the way through the end story of the Bible. But to take it further, the expansion of the church, the heir to God's promises, to this title of being the people of God in the biblical story, is not a different nation, it's the church, right? It's the Christian community. We are the ones who are that heir. We're the institution that Jesus founded while he was on earth, and we're still here. So to suggest that some other nation has taken on that mantle, even the United States, is problematic, which is why Peter says, no, you as in the people of God, you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of God who called you out of darkness and into the marvelous light. So I'll acknowledge that I didn't have a lot of mercy, I guess, for this perspective. I do think we have to be very clear in rejecting American exceptionalism as an interpretation of the biblical story, That's just wrong. But if we move back a little bit through this reasoning, a less ambitious claim, if we will, is to say that people should be celebrating the 4th of July or should be acknowledging the greatness of the United States of America, not because it specifically is the nation that's designed to save the world, but because people are supposed to do this wherever they find themselves, in any nation, that this is a responsibility as different kinds of peoples. And the passage that is cited over and over again in support of this is Romans chapter 13, one of the passages that Coralyn read for us just a few moments ago. Oh, well, that's not right. Here we go. Sorry, some of this, there might be some flaws in this PowerPoint this morning. The fireworks were throwing me off last night. But a verse that's often cited is, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities have been instituted by God." Now, there are a couple of points that we might draw out from this. One is the comment that the authorities, the governing authorities that exist, have been instituted by God. God created them, and therefore they must be good. And if they are a good part of God's creation, why not celebrate them here on a Sunday morning? And further, a passage like this tells us that we, each of us, ought to be subject to these authorities. We ought to go along with what they ask for and what they need. And if the United States declares that July the 4th is a national holiday, then we ought to recognize it as a national holiday. That's part of what it means to submit to your government authorities. And then I mentioned before that toward the end of this passage, there's a line that's specifically cited that names several different ways in which we ought to pay this respect specifically. Pay taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, and honor to whom honor is due. So, many people argue with biblical backing that this means that it is important, appropriate, and even obligatory for Christians to be honoring their nation by doing things like singing songs for the nation, saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and things along these lines. But there are several problems with this interpretation. The first thing that I point out is that people often cut Romans 13 off from the material that immediately precedes it and that immediately follows it, even though Paul doesn't do that in the original letter. And one of the passages that I thought I had, but I guess I don't, is the very next verse, Romans 13:8, talks about debt. And it says, "Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt that we have to love one another." In other words, one of the main purposes of this entire section is to encourage the Christians in Rome not to allow themselves to be indebted to anybody. And so the way that what this means is that if you are part of the city, and the city of Rome in particular was one that had a number of different benefits to it. There were public baths. Sometimes food was distributed on the streets to the people. Roads were paved to make it possible for people to travel to Rome all around. And all of these are good things. All of these are appropriate functions of government. So if you benefit from the food in your home, then pay the taxes. I mean, that's an appropriate thing to do. If you are a person who uses the roads because a wealthy patron came through and donated money so that we could all have these roads, then sure, go to the celebration of that patron. Honor them with the honor that is due. But do these things so that you won't be accused of being in debt to anybody, not to further put yourself in the debt of different kinds of nations. And the way that many people interpret this passage is to flip it and say the exact opposite. To say that Christians are indebted to the nations and the peoples in which they find themselves, and so they need to pay taxes and they need to give respect and they need to give honor because of that debt. But that's problematic for another reason. If I can find it, the other reason is that these are conditional statements, right? Like, Paul isn't saying that you should always pay taxes or always give respect. He says, do it when it's right. Give what is due. Pay taxes to whom taxes are due. Revenue to whom revenue is due. Presumably, this means that if we don't owe someone taxes, if they're using that money appropriately, then maybe we shouldn't pay it. If someone does something that isn't honorable, then we don't need to give them that honor. This passage actually, as much as it is cited today as a passage in defense of government, was originally one that offered a kind of critique of government. Because Paul lived during a time when the Roman emperors claimed that they were gods, or at least they were treated by the people around them as being gods. And Paul says, no, 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 no. It's not that they are gods. God, who is above them, has put them there. And so when it's appropriate, we should go along with what it is that they're calling for us. But there's this implication, this space that says when they deviate from that, then maybe we should too. And that's a little bit more clear in the original language, which is harder to convey in English. But where it says things like, let every person be subject to the governing authorities or powers, the language that the scripture actually uses is ordering, right? It's not that God has instituted or created these powers, but God has ordered the world in a particular way. Humans are political animals. God did not create us to live in anarchy, to have each person just doing whatever they want. To have government, to have organization is a part of God's plan for humanity. We even have government here at Shalom as a part of the way that we make decisions as a church. This doesn't mean that there are people who are carrying around guns or who are going to knock on your door and throw you in jail if you don't do what the VAT wants you to do, but it does mean that there is a certain order to things, right? And if and so this passage is encouraging us to get ourselves inside of that order when it's functioning appropriately. But I don't think that this means that we ought to give our unconditional support to the United States of America any more than it meant that the early Romans should give unconditional support to an emperor like Nero, right? It's a way of rethinking about these things. But what about gratitude, right? This is the claim that I find to be the strongest out of all of the arguments that I've heard for celebrating the 4th of July. That we are in a place where we benefit tremendously from the United States of America, and so maybe it's appropriate for us to express gratitude. And I'll say that in the context of our specific conference, the congregation from which this strikes me the most is the Chin Burmese congregation, the Mara Christian Church, that actually worshiped here in our building. They tend to be extraordinarily patriotic. They're one of those churches that does the red, white, and blue and has the American flag going on the 4th of July. And it's easy to understand why. Their entire community lived in a place where the people were persecuted for being Christians, that they were not aligned with the government and the state religion, and so they fled. And to arrive here in a place where they are allowed to practice their faith in freedom, it's something that they're grateful for, that they want to express gratitude to God for in church on a Sunday morning. Shouldn't the rest of us who haven't had those experiences learn from that? Shouldn't we also have some space for gratitude? Well, maybe yes, but I think it's important for us to understand gratitude appropriately, right? There are two different ways that people talk about gratitude. There's gratitude that means appreciation for something that's done that benefits you, and there's gratitude that means indebtedness. Thank you for doing something. I owe you one. Let me give you an example that helps distinguish these, that works out conveniently because my wife is on call today. But let's imagine that we're talking about doing the dishes, right? A couple of nights ago, when Brittany and I came home, it was my turn to do the dishes. And the house was a mess. There were tons of dishes. She went to sleep early, fell asleep, putting one of the kids to sleep, and I stayed up late by myself cleaning all the dishes and picking up the house. Should she have been grateful to me for that? Well, it depends on how you mean it. If you mean that she can appreciate the fact that I put some effort into cleaning the house when I was tired and I would have rather gone to bed, sure, she can be grateful to that for that. Does it mean that she's indebted to me, that she owes me one, that the next day I can like sit around and ask her to wait on me? No, not at all, because it was my turn to do the dishes, right? That's part of what it means to be a part of a shared household with shared responsibilities. She might be appreciative of it, but we certainly don't want to inculcate an unhealthy sense of indebtedness, either on my end or honestly on hers. I think it's important for us to be thinking in these terms on a day like the 4th of July as well. Because we, as Christians, actually have a clearer idea than nations themselves do of what kinds of things they are supposed to do. And when nations do those things right, when, for example, they choose to be a nation of laws that treats people equally instead of showing favoritism in order to profit those in power, which is generally true here in the United States. When they give people the opportunity to worship God without putting a sword to their throat, which is generally true here in the United States, then we can be thankful that they are doing what they are supposed to be doing. It's not always easy to be doing these things when you're in positions of government. Sometimes there are pressures to go the other direction. But it is not healthy for us to develop a sense that it is those nations that have saved us and now we are indebted to them for it. That it's because of the heroic and violent acts of some of the states that we participate in that we're able to have that freedom today. And unfortunately, that is one of the major subtexts of a day like the 4th of July. It's not just saying to us, from a national perspective, that we are fortunate to be in this place, which we are, but that we owe it to the government to do the things they want us to do, to pay taxes perhaps for military weapons, to join the fight, uh, to look the other way when they do things to other countries that work to our advantage but hurt other people. And we have to be very careful to avoid that. After all, otherwise we will be falling into the false idea that it is military might that actually gives us freedom. That it's not God, but it is the people who are the rulers of these nations who control the world. And that's why we have to remember passages like the one in Psalms that says that some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Or perhaps we might even remember the words that Jesus said to Pilate, that you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. that ordering is a way of holding those above us in line, while also keeping ourselves accountable to participating when appropriate in those powers and principalities. So what can we learn from all of this? I I do think that there is some space for middle ground here. I think that we have gotten so polarized as a country that you hear one of two perspectives. You either hear people who just, in, in glowing terms, speak about how our nation is the greatest nation that has ever existed on the face of the earth, or people who only talk about how unjust and cruel and harsh it is. And we need to be able to pave a middle way in this. I think it is appropriate for us to express gratitude for the things that the United States has done well. But we have to be careful not to let this be propaganda. And we have to continue to have the courage to also name the things that the country has done poorly and the ways in which it's failed. And yes, it is appropriate for us to pray for government leaders. We probably don't do that enough here at a church like Shalom. But it's not because we believe that they are the ones who control the world, but rather that we recognize that God often works through them, or sometimes despite them, and that can have a tremendous impact on the people who live here. And I also say I think it's appropriate for us to celebrate our own culture. There are good things about being American, right? This is a part of our identity for many of us. It is okay to like barbecues and baseball and apple pie or whatever it is that you associate with the United States of America, right? But not in a way that elevates our culture over others, but as one among many in the kaleidoscope of peoples that God has created. And that appreciation of our own culture is something that we distinguish from our political allegiance. We have to bear in mind these words from Philippians that our citizenship is in heaven. That for us, first and foremost, we are God's people. And to the extent we can, we'll be supportive of the nation to which we find ourselves. But our ultimate allegiance is to Jesus Christ and his church.